Hello, everybody. My name is Bryce Wakefield, and I'm the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and I'm joined here in our studio by Clive Hamilton. Hello, Clive.
G'day, Bryce.
And also from Berlin by Marika Ulberg. Hello, Marika. Well, it's been an interesting couple of weeks. The Prime Minister very recently has warned of cyber attacks by a certain state party, usually assumed to be China. The Chinese government has warned its citizens of racism in Australia and has warned Chinese students that they perhaps should consider other destinations. The Chinese government has slapped tariffs on Australian barley. ASIO has raided a New South Wales Labor MP over his links to China, and today we've had the announcement that the Australian government would acquire long-range ballistic and anti-ship missiles to counter an adversary in the Indo-Pacific region. At the AIIA National Conference last year, we pondered the question of whether or not there was a new Cold War emerging in the region between the United States and its allies and China. My guests today might say that the Cold War never ended, at least from China's perspective. So to talk about that and to talk about the subject of their new book, Hidden Hand, exposing how the Chinese Communist Party is reshaping the world, I'll now hand things over to Clive and Marika. Take it away, Clive.
Thanks very much, Bryce, and thanks to the AIIA for putting on this event for the book. The origin of the book is really Silent Invasion, the earlier book that I wrote about CCP influence in Australia. And it was suggested actually by the publisher that because there was such a strong interest in Australia for analysis of CCP influence, it would be useful, indeed valuable, to do something similar for the West, by which we mean the North America and Western Europe in essence, although there's some about Australia in the book. And so I mulled over this idea and realised that I could not write such a book by myself, and so I was in Berlin and met Marika and thought she'd be perfect, and I was very, very pleased when she agreed that it would be an important book and worthwhile participating, and therefore that's how we came to collaborate on writing this book. And we wrote it because we both believe that there's a well-organised and systematic attempt by the Chinese Communist Party to reshape the world order in the interests of the party. And we also believe that there's widespread ignorance and also naivety about China under the CCP in Western countries. And this has led to a dangerous way of dealing with China, even amongst those countries that enjoy that experience a kind of skeptical attitude towards the CCP regime. There's a real lack of understanding about what the CCP is, what its kind of DNA is and its modus operandi, and how it goes about influencing and interfering in other countries, and in this case, Western nations. So what we set out to do in the book was to uncover and then write about the evidence of the comprehensive Chinese Communist Party influence and interference work that it has been conducting over a very long time. And despite the fact that most people who read the newspapers today think of Beijing as engaging in a very upfront, aggressive, out there kind of diplomacy and form of international relations, in fact, deep beneath that exterior, there has been and remains a deeply covert program of undermining democracy and rights in other nations. And these covert attempts are not well understood and not well recognised. And it's this ignorance about it which we want to try to dispel, because we believe that shedding light on the operations of the CCP, which prefers to operate in the shadows, is the best way to counteract its effects on the democratic process and the exercise of rights. So, as the title suggests, the book is a detailed expose of this global program of influence and interference and subversion of Western institutions. And we focus particularly on the ways in which the Chinese Communist Party carries out its influence operations on the elites in Western countries. That is, elites in politics, in business, in universities, in the cultural sphere, which is particularly interesting and rarely recognised. And so that's why in the book Silent Invasion, and also in the new book Hidden Hand, there's a great deal of emphasis on the elites, and particularly trying to identify certain individuals in order to explain how this process takes place. A very strong theme coming through the book, I'm sure we'll talk about it at some length during today's session, and on which Marika is an expert, being a sinologist with particular expertise on the CCP's external propaganda system. The strong theme running through the book is the way in which the Chinese Communist Party has attempted, with some very considerable success, to reshape the global narrative about China's role in the world, about the Chinese Communist Party, and the relationship between China and other countries. And some of the messages that it's been communicating in many subtle ways has been to promote the idea that autocracies are better than democracies in responding to the modern problems of the world. And of course, COVID-19, which has been in some ways a disaster for the CCP around the world, has been a very fruitful ground for the party to promote the idea that autocracies are better at responding to that kind of crisis. It set out systematically to present China as a reliable partner in the global community at a time when the US has become a global rogue. And in that sense, Donald Trump, while being the president, has pushed back against China after a series of presidents who've gone weak-kneed when called upon to do it. And in that sense, Donald Trump's presidency has nevertheless been, in a way, a godsend to China, because he does behave like a rogue, because he does reinforce perceptions in the West and elsewhere that the US is a rogue on the international stage. And the party also wants to persuade many around the world that party sources are the most credible in explaining the world, the ones that are believed above all else. We might find this in some ways fanciful in the West, but there are many places in the world where this isn't regarded as a fanciful proposition. And finally, and I'll finish on this note, the CCP has put enormous effort into the Belt and Road Initiative as a narrative framework for promoting a certain conception of China and an understanding of the nature of the Chinese government. And one of the strongest themes, which I think, or most interesting themes, which I think came through in the book, and is something which I learnt in the process of researching and writing it, in large measure through my collaboration with Marika, is the way in which the Belt and Road Initiative is, at one level, all about, as the propaganda goes, trade and investment and connectivity and building infrastructure and creating a more integrated world to the benefit of all. Underneath that is a far more interesting, far more subtle, and far more, we would argue, perilous program on the part of the Chinese Communist Party, and that is to use the Belt and Road Initiative as a way of reshaping the global narrative. And we see that, and we explain this in the book in some detail, how the Belt and Road Initiative is used as a kind of ideological Trojan horse, if I can use that overworked metaphor, to win influence among elites and to seed a new way of thinking about China and the global community one that is developed by Chinese Communist Party propagandists and party theorists in Beijing. So I might stop at that point and allow Marika to take up the story.
Okay, video's back on. Yeah, thank you so much to the AIA for hosting us here for this. I want to supplement Clive's introduction about the basic idea of the book and what we cover by zooming in on basically the motivations and strategies used by the primary actor that we cover. And as you've already seen or heard, we talk not about China, we don't talk about Chinese interference, Chinese influence, et cetera, we specifically focus on the Chinese Communist Party. We think it's incredibly important to distinguish between China, the Chinese, and the one hand, and the Chinese Communist Party on the other hand, for several reasons. One, because the Chinese Communist Party likes to portray itself as like the only conveyor of truth about all things Chinese, and that is obviously not true. China is a lot more diverse than this. It's also important to make sure that under suspicion doesn't fall on actually Chinese people of Chinese heritage. But there's also, you can also make a case very clearly that you need to look at this from the perspective, at this topic from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, because understanding the motivation behind what is happening and also understanding the basic approach of that the party takes in its global influence operations is essentially a transfer of a lot of strategies and principles that the party also uses in China itself. So that's basically globally transferred. Yet somehow we have tended to write the CCP out of the picture a little bit. We talk about President Xi Jinping, even though the fact that Xi Jinping is president of China is basically meaningless. What's important is his leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. We talk about things such as the PLA. We think of the People's Liberation Army as the Chinese army, but it's actually not a state army, it's a party army, just like media aren't state-owned, they're party-owned. So the party really is the central actor, as most of you who are here are probably aware. But this is also true for the basic motivation behind influencing. And the basic idea here is what is the Chinese Communist Party trying to achieve? And the basic goal here really is to make the world safer for itself, to create long-term legitimacy for itself, and to make sure that this long-term legitimacy will help it stay in power in the long run. Traditionally, they've relied on economic performance and nationalism for the legitimacy. Economic performance has kind of, been a little less and less stable over the last few years, and now with COVID-19 it's even riskier. Nationalism is a double-edged sword. So what they want is basic recognition, as Clive already said, that their system is ideal for the 21st century, is at least as good as democracies, if not, and increasingly in that direction, if not better. Because the party finds itself, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, the party has found itself in this position where it finds itself in a world it considers hostile, where it is one of the few communist parties left in the world. And initially it tried to manage this hostile world. It views itself as a hostile world, like Cold War thinking never really stopped in China. The Cold War never ended for the CCP. So initially, the party tried to deal with that through patriotic education of its citizenry and setting up censorship mechanisms. But the whole idea here is, in the long run, the CCP thinks we cannot rely on things such as the Great Firewall. We have to make sure that the world itself changes and becomes more beneficial to our interests. That includes stuff such as what the party refers to as the global public opinion environment, that basically it's not enough if the party keeps saying we're the best and our narrative is the right thing to Chinese people. People all around the world have to repeat it in order for the party to feel secure in the long run. This is what the party refers to as its global discourse power, which it needs to strengthen. And the other factor, of course, here is the global alliance system, which the party wants to reshape in its own favor, because right now China doesn't have a lot of allies and it is surrounded by systems of US alliances around itself. So the whole idea is increase its own discourse power and weaken existing alliance systems, the existing structures, to make sure that China and the CCP is strengthened. In terms of the strategies that the party employs here, what we see is a classic approach that we also see domestically, which has been referred to as the United Front thinking, United Front principle. You've probably heard about United Front work and the United Front work department. What I'm talking about here is the underlying concept of United Front thinking, where you divide basically all people in China, all groups in the world, all countries in the world into three areas, like the friendly ones, the neutral camp, and the enemy camp. And the idea is to make sure that you ally as many neutral and friendly entities against the principal enemy. The principal enemy will vary according to the situation that you look at. If you're looking at a single nation state, for instance, China looking at Australia and says our goal is we want to get Australia to sign on to the Belt and Road. And the federal government says, no, we don't want to. So in that case, the federal government is the main obstacle, and you have to work with all potential allies, which in this case would include provinces and states, to basically surround that state and make sure to work against that. On a global level, the principal enemy is the United States, which is considered the global hegemon. So what you have to do in order for China to succeed in this field, for the CCP to succeed, is win over as many US allies as possible, or rather make sure that countries that were previously allied with the United States first move into a position where they are neutral if there's a conflict between the United States and China, so they take no position, to move them from the enemy camp to the neutral zone, and eventually to move them from the neutral zone into the friend zone, where they don't just stay neutral on any conflict, but they actually actively side with China. So this is one principle that's very important, to divide countries into these camps and to just align as many as possible, and sometimes often temporary alliances, to just shift the overall balance of power. Another really important thing is you don't try to pick fights with too many at the same time. What you usually try is you pick one country and you try to isolate it and make an example of it. In Europe, this has happened to Sweden, which picked a fight with the Chinese government because the Chinese government kidnapped a Swedish citizen, who's now supposedly, according to the Chinese government, renounced the Swedish citizenship and is sitting in jail for 10 years. But under the circumstances, the Chinese government really ran a sustained campaign against Sweden. Not so much to win over the Swedes, but maybe to make an example of them. And a quite similar thing recently happened to Australia, when Australia demanded that there be an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. Of course, later that demand was picked up by more and more countries, so that in the end, China said, we'll have that inquiry. But Australia, as the initiator of that inquiry, of that proposal, was then subsequently punished by the CCP with restrictions on exports, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, unfortunately, the standard reaction on the international stage is lack of solidarity. Instead of standing up for one another, most countries are simply glad that it hit someone else and not us. I'm gonna stop here so that we can start our question and answer part, but this was just meant as a very brief introduction to the motivations behind what we're describing and the principles of what is going on. And I'm very happy to go into more concrete details and examples in our discussion. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, Marika and Clive. A great introduction, set the scene for what are the growing number of questions, but I'm going to ask my question first, as usual. You mentioned, Marika, that you mentioned patriotic education, which got me thinking about a few things. And to what degree, it sounds to me like the premise of your book is that this strategy is tightly controlled by elites in Beijing and particular figures, and it's a very conscious divide and conquer strategy, if you like. And it's wedded to particular notions of the Chinese state that are informed by perhaps things like the patriotic education policy. But when I think back to the early 2000s, there was some discussion among Asia scholars that the patriotic education viewpoint had gotten out of hand to some extent, and that there were elites in Beijing who did not like the sort of caustic narratives that were coming out of protest movements in China, for example, but felt that they had to respond. To what degree do you think that the forces that you're talking about are really in control of the elites that you consider?
That's an interesting question, and it kind of ties to something that I also said when in the introduction. Basically, I agree that in the long run, the CCP wants to get away from nationalism as the principal form, as a legitimator for itself, precisely for the reason that you mentioned, is it's this double-edged sword, because it can be deployed. And I do think the party has more control. Like, the party will say, oh, we have no control over it. I think the party is quite adept at signaling to people when to stop, and at signaling to people when to start. And when they do signal that it's time to stop, oftentimes people do stop. That all said, yes, I agree absolutely that they want to get away from nationalism as this legitimating factor for themselves, because precisely it can be turned against the party. It can result in calls from intellectuals or people on the fringes to call for actually tougher action, and to say the Chinese government isn't being tough enough, and they need to do more to stand up for China's interests. So I do think they want to get away from that. This is precisely why they're looking towards more narrative and discursive control, and what's referred to in Beijing as ideological security, as a force of legitimacy. That, again, this isn't just about, yay, China is the best, and we're going to stand up for China's interests, which is still relevant, and this is still happening a lot. But on top of that, they want to have a more permanent form of legitimacy that cannot as easily be used against the party. And this is kind of where this discursive power on a global scale actually comes in, because the idea is, we're competent and we are internationally recognized as the best system for China. Look, your population, all the foreign politicians are saying the same thing. This is where the party wants to get, so that precisely it doesn't really have to rely on shoring up nationalism anymore when it wants to, cover up any problem. So I do think there's awareness of that.
Okay, very good. Clive.
I'd just add that to reinforce Marika's view that nationalism, they're kind of riding the tiger, and we've seen some kind of uncontrolled outbursts of patriotic sentiment that the party has decided not in its interests. I mean, there were some anti-Japanese riots, for example, that got out of hand, and the party had to crack down very hard against them in Beijing and elsewhere within China. But there is a kind of historical irony in all of this, because when the CCP decided after Tiananmen Square that they would put a huge amount of emphasis on patriotic education, so to the point where many of the Chinese students who arrive in Australia are intensely patriotic, and in fact studies have shown they become more patriotic while they're studying overseas, not all but some. And of course history has been completely reshaped so that they come to Australia and discover all kinds of things if they're open to it about China's history, like, for example, what happened in 1989. But there's a great irony that having been very much an internationalist party, focused on solidarity of the workers of the world, very much in the kind of Comintern tradition. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, China under the CCP began to develop a very, very strong basis of nationalism for the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. The party said, you know, we represent China. They even rehabilitated Confucius, for God's sake, who was dismissed as, you know, an evil bourgeois influence during the Cultural Revolution. So we might kind of see it come full circle in that if the CCP succeeds in its determination to have discourse control over the narrative in the rest of the world, and they're very serious about this. You know, as the Global Times let slip at one point in an article that, you know, it sees the Great Firewall as a temporary protective device against the infiltration of dangerous Western ideas. And it's temporary because the CCP anticipates a time when those Western ideas in the West will be defeated, and CCP ideals will be the dominant ones, and therefore you won't need a barrier between China and the rest of the world. And so, having achieved its objective, if it does, there would be a new kind of internationalism where, you know, the workers of the world and the bourgeois of the world would unite once again under that kind of umbrella of CCP discourse power.
Okay, great. So we have, I mean, I have more questions of my own, but I don't think I'm going to need them. We did have a question I saw from Patrick Moore, who talked about whether or not, where is it? So why is China today seemingly antagonizing as many, I guess, as it can, such as the United States, Australia, UK, Hong Kong, India, South China Sea, etc. So I guess if I want to flesh out this question a little bit, my understanding of your argument would be that that you're saying that, having read a little bit of the book, that China has been covertly attempting to establish influence around the world, and I guess the corollary of that is that when it overtly attempts to do so with its wolf warrior diplomacy, for example, there's the potential to backfire. Do you think we're going to see more of this, or does China more of this assertive diplomacy, or do you think that China would prefer to do things in a more subtle way, I guess?
Well, I think it's doing both. It's doing the assertive approach as well as the subtle approach. And, you know, we talk about this quite a lot in the context of Europe, of the kind of dual approach to asserting, gaining influence. It's a bit of a puzzle as to why, in the midst of the coronavirus, well, it's a puzzle to me at least, Marika might be less puzzled, why Beijing has decided to become so aggressive in its diplomacy where it's not getting its way. Marika's given some of the explanation, and that is a particular CCP viewpoint where it distinguishes between friends and enemies and those in between, and isolating those it regards as enemies, who are always a small handful of, you know, if you read CCP or CCP-linked newspapers in China and abroad, they even characterize Australia, you know, the broad populace of Australia are actually sympathetic to China. And it's only a small handful of troublemakers who are creating the problem. And the troublemakers have come to include very recently in Australia ASPI. ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute for those overseas, has become a kind of a whipping boy for the Chinese Communist Party. And they are an example of the small group of troublemakers. And so the party believes that it can, at the one time, defeat this small group of troublemakers, wherever they may be, in Australia, in Hong Kong, in the United States, or in Sweden. But the mass of the people will see the value of the Chinese Communist Party, or China's way of doing it, and the benefits of engaging with China economically and becoming friends of China. And so I think that it has decided, speculating here, that Beijing has decided that China is now sufficiently powerful that it doesn't have to pretend to be anything other than it is. And Xi Jinping's position within the party is now very strong, after it was a bit wobbly during the early weeks of the coronavirus crisis, they're kind of going for broke. And so it's very hard to predict how that might unfold. I'm sure Marika will have more to say.
I think that is one possible explanation, that it's like it is how it is and the world can see us now. My interpretation, and this is my educated guess, because obviously I can't look into the heads of anybody sitting in Beijing, but my sense is that even though the CCP is trying to make it seem like it has weathered the coronavirus crisis, it has taken quite a big hit. It did not announce any GDP numbers for this year. It is struggling with quite massive unemployment. So I do think, even though I don't think that Xi Jinping is in a position where he's like insecure and is going to get toppled or anything, but the party itself is in a way operating in what you could term crisis mode. And in crisis mode, what the party seems to do more than usual, I mean, the motivation, the first line, the most important audience is always domestic, and the international audience is always secondary. But in times of crises, I think the focus inward actually becomes more intense. The focus on the domestic audience and on shoring up domestic sentiment becomes more important than international recognition. So under these circumstances and operating in crisis mode, where the party needs to weather a fairly big economic crisis, the internal audience is more important, and it's okay to pick more battles with people abroad than usual. So the party is basically deviating from its principle of, we make sure we only pick battles with a couple of countries at a time, and make sure we establish harmonious, constructive relationships with everybody else. The party's going against that. And I do think at least some people in the party are aware that that's backfiring, but I think that is a product to some extent of this crisis mode of China turning inwards. And rethinking basically its strategy of how are we going to cope with this, because obviously this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, is not over. We're probably going to be dealing with the disease itself for at least a year or longer. We're going to be dealing, I think, with the economic fallout for much longer than that. So this is basically the party focusing inward and making what could be considered mistakes from our perspective internationally by being too offensive and by offending too many people at the same time. But it makes sense from the internal crisis mode logic. And basically, I think they may tone down some of it, because again, some people are quite aware that this is offending countries, so they may go back to the smarter approach of just picking fights with a few countries at the same time. But as long as this crisis is with us, I think there's always going to be potential for things escalating in this direction.
Great, thanks so much, Clive and Marika. We have a question here from our friends at the Swiss Embassy, how they ask about multilateral diplomacy and what are the implications of your argument for international law and the global rules-based order. I know in your book that you've got an entire chapter called Reshaping Global Governance. If you'd like to talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Absolutely. But I'll go ahead on this one. So basically, the Chinese government likes to say of itself that they support multilateralism, and they like to get other countries to repeat that China is a force for multilateralism, and that, it supports this, unlike the United States, which is pulling out of everywhere. The thing is, no, China isn't really a good thing for multilateralism at all, because one, it doesn't particularly love multilateral institutions. It prefers to have one-on-one bilateral relationship, which you can see in frameworks such as 17+1 in Europe, which I think have been accurately described as 17 relationships of one-on-one. Because, China has a big advantage there, because in one-on-one relationships, it's always going to be the bigger country. There's always also a strong tendency from the Chinese government to push for non-binding things in all international organizations that already exist. So the general trend here is, yes, the Chinese Communist Party wants to get involved in these organizations, but it wants to make sure that these organizations have no power to enforce any binding targets on a sovereign state, primarily such as itself. It doesn't want to bind itself to those rules. So even when we talk about climate cooperation, which I do think is necessary to do with China, the CCP will always make sure, or will always push towards non-binding targets, nation states basically policing themselves on those targets. And I mean, as we know from, I guess, companies self-policing on targets isn't usually very effective. So I think in that regard, we actually have a problem with a stronger Chinese presence in those international organizations. It actually weakens some of the progress that we have made in that order in working towards binding targets in some of the international regimes that we've set up. And that's a problem.
Very good. All right, we have a question here from Susan Green. You talked at some length, I think, of a sort of divide and conquer strategy where China would focus on different levels of government. Susan Green asks, how would you characterize Victoria signing up to the Belt and Road Initiative? Naive, harmless, since the state is not responsible for foreign policy, or something else? And I think I'll give this one to Clive first, because it is an Australian question. So,
yeah, I mean, it's a very fascinating example to watch how it's unfolded in Victoria. It has certain parallels with the way in which the CCP went about grooming certain members of the elites in Italy, which, as you know, is the only Western nation that has signed a Belt and Road agreement. And so I've been watching it for quite some time, that is events in Victoria, and the way in which the Labor Party in particular, although there are similar forces operating within the Liberal Party, United Front organisations and influential individuals within the Chinese Australian community have been establishing networks with certain Labor figures, in particular the Premier Andrews himself, and effectively, what I've begun to call grooming. I actually wrote a kind of definition of grooming, which I like to use in this context, and that means the use of psychological techniques to befriend and establish a rapport with a target in order to lower their inhibitions, create a sense of reciprocity, and opening them up to see the world in a way that suits one's interests. And so what's been fascinating about the Victorian example is a couple of things. One is the way in which those members of the Victorian political and business elites that have been strongly pushing for Victoria to sign up to the Belt and Road Agreement have fallen for the CCP narrative about the Belt and Road Agreement, what it means and what the benefits are. And when you look at the Belt and Road Agreement itself, the Victorian one, and wherever they do become public, this is particularly interesting to do, there's a kind of headline clauses which talk about trade agreements and investment facilitation and interconnectivity and that kind of thing. But if you look further down the agreements, and this is the case with the Victorian ones, there are all these kind of soft and cuddly clauses you tend to skip over as thinking it's not very important. I would argue actually they're more important than the trade and investment provisions, and they're all about clauses which establish mechanisms for greater people-to-people exchange and cultural exchanges and media agreements. And these are the ways in which the CCP plans to assert its discourse power. And what's been interesting with the Victorian one is that we've noticed, as we've noticed in other countries that have signed up to them, is that those elite members who are at the forefront of pushing forward the agreements and speaking on behalf of them, they begin to adopt the CCP language. They begin to speak in the kind of terminology developed by the party that the party uses to surround and promote the Belt and Road Agreements. And so it's as if, language like, actually in the Victorian Belt and Road Agreement, it commits the state, I've got this bit of it here, the aspiration of promoting the Silk Road spirit, centering on peace, cooperation, openness, inclusiveness, mutual learning and mutual benefits, and aspiration to further enrich such spirit in keeping with the new era. I mean, this is just infused with CCP ideology, this kind of statement, and yet it's kind of deniable. But I notice that Daniel Andrews, he speaks CCP speak when he talks about the way in which he wants to make Victoria China's gateway to Australia, and the win-win situations and the friendships and peace and harmony and cooperation that the Belt and Road Agreement will establish. So I think it's been quite a brilliant achievement on behalf of the party to have Victoria sign up to the BRI as an illustration, and Marika alluded to this earlier, of the CCP tactic of using the countryside to surround the city.
Very good. Okay. We have another question here from Marika. Did you want to chime in on that question at all? Or? No? Okay, good. So we have another question here from Robert Webster, and it's about the, well, let me just read it. The picture you paint of the CCP under Xi is immutable and all-powerful. Is there no prospect of dissent, disunity, or change, especially if the economic miracle cannot be continued? So is there a possibility that things could go another way, and especially if the economic benefits that the party has been promising dissolve?
Just briefly, I'm sure Marika will be able to expatiate on this better than I can, but yeah, I mean, the position of the party is fragile, and the party knows that. I mean, all kinds of things could come along and profoundly undermine it. A financial crisis is probably the one that most threatens its viability. A very big outbreak of coronavirus could lead to all kinds of trouble. I mean, Wuhan became, for a few weeks there, kind of ungovernable, and the people of Wuhan were extremely angry and took a lot of effort to bring them under control. In the longer term, Xi and party people know that China's aging population represents a severe threat to the sustained growth, and there's some belief that Xi and the party recognise that China has a window of opportunity no more than perhaps 20 years in order to establish its global domination, because it'll be much more difficult thereafter. And within the party itself, Xi, of course, set about from late 2012, when he became General Secretary of the party. He went about ruthlessly purging the party of alternative opinion, cemented his power, but also creates all kinds of problems of groupthink and fear within, particularly in the provincial elements of the party, as we saw again illustrated with the outbreak of the pandemic in Wuhan. It can lead to all kinds of problems.
Yeah, here's the thing. I think this, sorry if I may add to that. I think, yeah, absolutely. And again, what we're presenting here and the strategy of the party is not just born out of confidence. It is also born out of the lessons that the party has taken in from the Soviet Union. We've studied that quite systematically. What did the Soviet Union do wrong? If you are an unelected official, you are a lot more nervous about power transitions than you are as an elected official, because generally it doesn't look pretty if there is no transfer power mechanisms. With Xi Jinping, his basically, with his presidency for life, has destroyed what little power transition mechanisms that actually were within the Communist Party, at least internally. So right now, yes, a large horror scenario within the party that motivates a lot of what it does is either the Soviet scenario or even a Romanian scenario where people don't just get kicked out, but they get killed. And I think they take that quite seriously. I do think, especially under Xi Jinping, we have completely moved away from a prospect for this ending peacefully, because the party has And it's not like if there's discontent, there are very easy ways for people to be able to topple the party, because the party made very sure that it's incredibly difficult for dissent within the population to translate into organized dissent, where society can actually link up and push back. A lot of energy that the party has expended has gone in two areas. One is the domestic public security state and surveillance, and the other is, of course, the loyalty of the military that is sworn to the party and to the General Secretary Xi Jinping personally. So I do think there's plenty of room for conflict, but also a lot of ways in which the party has made sure that this cannot easily translate into it being ousted from power. So when that conflict arises, it might get very ugly for the people who are trying to bring that change about, mainly because Xi Jinping has led the party into the situation where it's very difficult to bring any change from within.
Okay, very good. Very good. The question then that raises, and that's been being raised in my mind, is that what do we do about it? There's a question here from Karen Zhang, for example. She says, how should Australia, and I guess other countries, other middle powers, perhaps in Europe as well, approach a power like China? Do you think it works for or against Australia's interests to be loud in our approach towards China on the international stage? The typical response has been to approach China with a certain degree of delicacy. Is that something that we ought to reconsider?
I think honestly, I think loud diplomacy works better than silent diplomacy. I mean, silent diplomacy is better than not talking about anything, but I think there is this fear among our politicians that if they engage in loud diplomacy, then they won't be able to actually work with the Chinese government in the areas where they feel they absolutely have to work with China, such as climate change, global health, et cetera. I think we need to get away from that. And that basically what governments have to do is get a better understanding of the party, its interests, and where there are mutual interests, if any. Because the thing is, if the CCP is really interested in a form of cooperation, that cooperation will happen regardless of how loud the government is on the international stage. It may get delayed for reasons like send a signal, but if the party wants it, that cooperation is going to happen. If the party doesn't want that cooperation, or if the Australian or the European or the whatever side is way more interested in something than the CCP is, that cooperation proposal is on very shaky legs to begin with, and you can stand on your head and dance and praise the CCP, you're not going to get a meaningful result. Case in point, the European governments have been trying to get an investment agreement from China, where basically they're getting concessions from the CCP. It's been ongoing for 7 years, and it's not going to happen because, again, this is much more in the interest of the Europeans than in the Chinese. European governments then hold themselves back in the hopes of getting some concessions from the Chinese government, which they're not going to get. So I think, honestly, my biggest advice to any country is just be more realistic about what you can do in cooperation with the Chinese government. What are their interests? If you have actual mutual agreement and not just the CCP says, oh yeah, we love multilateralism too. If you have actual agreement based on their own core interests, proceed, but also criticize, because it's not going to endanger that. If you don't have that, honestly, you're not going to get anything meaningful. You may get an agreement that's going to have a lovely red seal on it, but it's not going to be, it's going to be broken at the first instance. And that's really my main advice. Get this realistic assessment of the party you're dealing with.
Okay, Clive.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think Australia and European countries and Canada in particular have been blighted for years by this belief that the Chinese Communist Party, the whole regime has this extraordinary mystique about it. You need experts who really understand it, who can explain the position. And it's a very kind of delicate, fragile relationship. And, you know, because we don't understand it, we must tread very carefully and do all we can to keep Beijing happy. And of course, this is exactly, you know, Beijing has nations, you know, by the proverbials when they're behaving in that way. And so how should we react? I mean, well, it depends on what kind of country you are, where you are. I mean, the United States can behave in a way that quite unlike Australia can. I don't think Australia should be loud, but nor should we be fearful and delicate. I mean, the DFAT approach of, of treading on tiptoes and not saying anything to offend Beijing, I think has been very damaging to Australia's interests for very many years. So the alternative between delicate and loud is firm and calm, really making it clear what our position is, making it clear what our values are, making it clear what we're not going to trade off for economic interests, but doing it calmly but firmly and consistently. Because once you give some ground, the CCP will believe that they have you again, and they'll keep pushing and pushing. And that's why, although obviously, for those who know me, I'm not a person that has much ideological concordance with the Morrison government, I think the approach that it's taking in this very difficult time is really exactly right. And so nations like Australia, in responding to Beijing in the way it's been behaving in recent years, we have to set up defences against it. We have to set up ways of protecting democratic institutions in our political process from CCP interference. And so it's extremely gratifying, I have to say, to see the AFP moving for the first time against an alleged foreign interference operation in Sydney when it raided the home and office of the New South Wales Labor MP, and in particular, I think more importantly, the staff member who is suspected of being engaged in some kind of foreign interference activity. And so the putting into practice of Australia's potentially very powerful foreign interference legislation, I think, is something that many people have been waiting for, and certainly many nations or governments in Ottawa and Washington and London and Tokyo have been watching very closely indeed. And of course, the last thing, which almost goes without saying, but it's of such fundamental importance, and that is for a nation like Australia and others to deal with Beijing, we must do it collectively. I mean, no single country can stand up to Beijing indefinitely. It's essential that democratic nations form alliances of one form or another, or cooperative agreements of ways of pushing back to reduce CCP influence abroad, including in those international institutions. And we've seen that the way in which Western nations allowed Beijing to gain very substantial influence within the WHO, we've seen that in recent months, the reputation of the WHO has been shattered. I mean, it was such an appalling approach by the WHO to allow itself, or the member states to allow the WHO to become, if not captive, then certainly heavily influenced by Beijing in a way where throughout January of this year, the WHO was giving credibility to, by reproducing, Beijing's narrative about COVID, and in particular, the claim that this was not a virus that was subject to community transmission. Now, when the WHO, wanting to be nice to Beijing and to have meetings with Xi Jinping, parroted misleading health information, the global consequences of that have been catastrophic. And it's no wonder that WHO has attracted such animosity from many quarters and will have to completely remake itself after. So that's what happens when you allow these international institutions to be influenced in this way without Western nations, those committed to proper international institutions that will serve the global community, allowing the CCP to gain influence in them.
Okay, then, I mean, that raises the question, I guess, of China's own or Chinese-led institutions as well. Zara Kimpton, hello again, Zara, asks, despite American objections, Australia joined the China-led Asian Infrastructure Bank, an investment bank. Do you think that this is serving our interests? Where is the money being spent, and how does this increase Chinese power via the BRI?
Well, very briefly, I'd just make the point that if a decision were to be made now about whether Australia should join the AIIB, I think the answer would almost certainly be no, because there's a much deeper understanding across government and the institutions and the bureaucracy of how there's another agenda going on, and that Australia joining it has been part of Beijing's program of dividing the Western alliance against itself. So whether it's now time to start considering withdrawal is not something that I'd be willing to comment on without much closer scrutiny.
No. Okay, there was a question here. I'm sorry I can't find it now because there are so many, but it was basically a question concerning your own personal experience and whether or not you have there have been any consequences of your research in ways. Have you come under pressure because of the type of research that you're putting out?
Marika?
I mean, yes and no. It's not as extreme as some of the things that some colleagues have experienced. There has been much more coordinated harassment against some people that I know, including email spoofing, spam emails sent out, people getting hacked, people getting targeted by various campaigns. I mean, what I get the occasional hate on social media, which I think if you get involved in any public debate, that's inevitable. But I mean, for me, the personal cost really is that I don't think I can go back to China. I don't think that as of yesterday, I can go back to Hong Kong. I've lived in China for a very long time. I've lived in Hong Kong for some time. In a way, both places I considered at least a partial home for a while, and I certainly can't go back, that I'm quite certain of. I don't think I would get a visa. And if I would get a visa, I would be a little suspicious why they're letting me in when they haven't let me in the past anymore. So it has a personal cost. This also obviously affects the things that I can research. Even though, I mean, access in China, even with people who go in for research, is getting more and more difficult anyway. But yeah, I mean, there's been this personal cost. And I do think, I mean, if the book becomes more popular and is read more widely, I do think there'll be some much uglier form of backlash than what we have faced so far.
Well, I think if silent invasion experience is anything to go by, you might want to strengthen your locks over there, Marika. If I can put this in a crude way, that people like us, if I can mention Marika in the same context, we've been protected in a certain way by the fact that, we're white. It's really people of Chinese extraction, not to mention, Chinese extraction, including Uyghurs and Tibetans, ethnically Chinese, of course. I mean, they've suffered kind of horrendous harassment and worse overseas. But I think the kind of wall of whiteness, if I can put it that way, is being breached around the world. And there are some really quite disturbing cases. Anne-Marie Brady in New Zealand, of course, with the burglaries on her home and office. John Garno in Melbourne has revealed that he and his family have suffered serious harassment in the street, as it were, by what are almost certainly MSS agencies. We read a deeply disturbing story about the campaign of attacks on the family of Mac Horton in Melbourne. For my own part, I don't like to say too much about it, but after Silent Invasion came out, I mean, it was a bit of a shock to me to find people turning up unbidden to my office and offering me counter-surveillance advice. I mean, I thought, whoa, I mean, I just wrote a book about China. Why do I need counter-surveillance advice? But yeah, certain things happened, and the office building I worked in, which is on the theology campus of 찰스스터트 University in Canberra, went from being a building that was open to anyone to walk through to being in complete lockdown with security cameras and the whole box and dice. And that wasn't done out of paranoia. That was done as a result of specific incidents taking place and advice from people whose job it is to look after the security of people who are threatened by state actors. So yeah, it's a serious issue, and it's certainly something that I take very seriously.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of the program, as it were. The book is Head in Hand, Exposing How the Chinese Communist Party is Reshaping the World by Clive Hamilton and Marika Olberg. I'd like to thank my guests today, Clive. Thank you very much. And Marika, it's great to have you here from Berlin. And I'd like to remind you all that the AIIA is a membership organization. We have branches around the country. If you are interested in what we do here, you might like to sign up as a member. Go on our website and check it out on our website, which is internationalaffairs.org.au. You can also check out our upcoming schedule of events. And if you stick around, we're also going to play you a list of those events so you can see them for yourself here. There's little for me to say, but again, to thank my guests and to thank you for tuning in. We're sorry that we couldn't get to all of the questions. We had quite a huge crowd tonight, so we might have to invite Clive back. Actually, in Australian Outlook, the online publication of the Institute, which you can also find at our website, there will be a review of Head in Hand coming out next week by John West. And one of the recommendations is that Clive should follow up with another book. So maybe we can have him back to talk about that. But for now, it's good night from me, and thanks again for tuning in.